The NGO founder was diverting humanitarian donations to his personal accounts. When I exposed him to the board, they voted to fire me. But they didn't know I had already sent the evidence to the donors, 2 journalists, and tax authorities in 3 countries. There are people who build their power on a noble cause, not because they believe in it. Or perhaps they do believe at the beginning, and at some point the cause becomes secondary to what the cause gives them: the admiration, the access, the money that flows toward an organization because the people who donate believe it is changing the world. That flow of trust converted into money is, when it falls into the wrong hands, the perfect raw material for the most cynical fraud that exists. The fraud that uses others' suffering as cover. I discovered it from the inside. And what I did with what I discovered was the most difficult and most clear decision of my professional life. My name is Isabella. I am 43 years old. I am a financial director specializing in international accounting and nonprofit organization governance. I have spent 17 years working in the sector, the last 4 an organization called Global Horizon that claimed to work on projects for access to clean water, education, and health in vulnerable communities in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and 2 in Central America. I say claimed because what was really funding, I discovered over time, was part of that and a very different part of that. The founder's name was Alejandro Montiel. He was 56 years old, Chilean, had lived in Europe for 2 decades, and had the kind of charisma that becomes credibility in international philanthropy circles. He knew how to talk about mission and impact in communities with an emotion that made the people listening to him want to give him money to keep doing what he was doing. What he was doing, in part, was spending it on himself. I joined Global Horizon 4 years ago with the belief, which was genuine at the time, that I was joining an organization doing real work in places where that work truly mattered. For the first 2 years, that belief held. The projects existed. The communities existed. There were field reports, photographs, impact evaluations. There was a team of people in the operating countries who clearly believed in what they were doing and did it with the dedication of someone who does not need to be paid well to do it well. It was in the 3rd year that I started to see the difference between the money coming in and the money reaching where it should reach. As financial director, I had complete access to the organization's accounts. It was part of my job: financial oversight, preparation of financial statements for donors, management of annual audits, allocation of funds to projects. It was a work I had been hired to do, and I did it with the rigor I had applied in every previous position. That rigor was what allowed me to see what I saw. The first pattern I noticed was in the founder's travel expenses. Alejandro traveled frequently, which was completely normal and expected in someone who ran operations in 6 countries. But when I reviewed the travel expenses with the attention I put into everything, I found trips that did not correspond with any scheduled activity of the organization, accommodations at hotels whose category was significantly above the travel policy the organization had in its own documents, and entertainment expenses with vague descriptions that could not be linked to any institutional representation activities. Donor money paying for dinners at restaurants costing several hundred euros per person that had no relationship with clean water in any community in any country. That, on its own, was irregular but could be argued as a gray area of management. What I found afterward was something else entirely. In the 5th month of silent internal investigation, I found the transfers. They were in the accounts of a restricted fund that Global Horizon had received from a European foundation. Restricted funds in nonprofit organizations have a very specific legal condition. They can only be used for the purpose for which the donor designated them, and any different use constitutes a violation of the donation conditions and, in many cases, a fraud. This fund was designated specifically for the construction of 3 clean water wells in a region of Uganda. The transfers from that fund went to an account that was not the operational account of any project in Uganda. It was an account at a bank in Switzerland. I traced the holder of that account through available records. It was a holding company registered in the British Virgin Islands whose ultimate beneficial owner, according to the company records I was able to obtain through international corporate information databases, was Alejandro Montiel. The money destined for water wells in Uganda was in the founder's personal account in Switzerland. It took me 3 weeks to fully process that information. Not because I had doubts about what I was seeing. The documents were clear. The records were verifiable. The chain between the restricted donation and the personal account was traceable. It took me 3 weeks because I needed to understand the complete scope before acting, and because understanding the complete scope required reviewing all restricted funds from the previous 4 years with the same attention I had given to the Uganda fund. What I found when I did that review was a pattern that had been operating for at least 3 years. 7 restricted funds from different donors, with specific purposes ranging from water wells to vaccination programs to school construction, had partial or total transfers toward accounts that ended up linked to Alejandro Montiel or to people in his immediate circle. The total amount I could trace was a figure that when I saw it consolidated required me to sit down and stop looking at the screen for a time before I could continue. It was not a slip. It was not a misunderstanding of the rules. It was an extraction system built with precision and maintained for years. I built the file with the methodology I would use to prepare an institutional-grade forensic audit. Each transfer documented with its origin, destination, date, and amount. The chain of legal entities connecting each destination account to Alejandro Montiel. The original restricted fund documents with their specific conditions. The comparison between the conditions of each fund and the actual use of the resources. The reports the organization had sent to donors describing the use of those funds, which in several cases described projects that had received less money than the reports declared. And something else I found at the end of the investigation. Internal emails between Alejandro and his trusted assistant that had been sent from organizational email accounts and that I could see in my capacity as administrator of the institutional communication system. Those emails contained specific instructions on how to structure the transfers so they would not be detectable in a standard audit. It was evidence of deliberate intent, evidence that this was not an error, but a plan. Before making any internal move, I sent the complete file to 4 external recipients. The first was the European Foundation that had contributed the Uganda Fund, which was the largest donor and the one with the clearest diversion documentation. I sent them the specific evidence about their fund with a letter explaining what I had found and what it meant for the use of their resources. The second and third were 2 journalists specializing in nonprofit organization investigation and corruption in the international aid sector. To both I sent the complete file with a letter requesting confidentiality until the institutional process I was about to initiate had an opportunity to develop, but authorizing them to proceed if within 2 weeks they had not received news of significant developments. The fourth went simultaneously to the tax authorities of 3 countries. Chile, where Alejandro had tax residency, Switzerland, where the identified accounts were located, and the Netherlands, where the European Donor Foundation was headquartered and where the donation conditions had specific legal implications. Having done that, I requested an urgent board of directors meeting. The board meeting was the most surreal moment of the entire process. There were 12 members on Global Horizon's board of directors, people with careers in the international cooperation sector, in academia, in the business world. People who on paper had the experience and judgment to evaluate financial evidence with the objectivity the situation required. What they did not have, I discovered in that meeting, was the capacity to separate Alejandro Montiel, the symbol of everything the organization represented, from Alejandro Montiel, the individual whose accounts I was showing on the screen. I presented the file for 45 minutes. Alejandro listened with the expression of someone who is calculating in real time. When I finished, he took the floor with the calm of someone who has handled difficult situations before and who knows exactly which button to press with each person in the room. He said that what I was presenting was the result of an incorrect interpretation of complex transactions that had legitimate explanations he would be willing to document in the coming days. That it was understandable that someone without experience in international financing structures might misinterpret what they were seeing. That, however, what concerned him was that the presentation of this information in such a dramatic way, without giving him the opportunity to explain, suggested either a technical incompetence that made my position untenable or a motivation that went beyond genuine concern for the organization. The room changed, not suddenly, gradually. with the way the board members started looking at me differently. The vote to initiate a separation process was 9-3. They asked me to hand over my credentials before leaving the building. I left the building. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for 20 minutes. Not from panic, from something closer to the equanimity of someone who knew exactly what they had done 3 days before that meeting and who knew exactly what was going to happen next. I called my attorney. I told her what had happened was what we had both expected to happen. She said perfect, that the process was already in motion from the outside, and that the dismissal was the kind of additional evidence that strengthened the case rather than weakening it. What happened over the following 6 weeks was the result of the decision I had made before entering that boardroom. The European Foundation froze all its active funds with Global Horizon within 48 hours of receiving my communication and notified other European foundations it had relationships with in the sector. The tax authorities of the 3 countries initiated coordinated investigations that included requests for banking information through the tax information exchange treaties in force. The 2 journalists published their investigations in the same week, 5 days apart, which generated sustained coverage that made it impossible for the case to pass without public response. Other donors who had not been contacted by me directly started asking their own questions when the journalistic coverage reached their desks. And 3 members of the board of directors who had voted in favor of my separation contacted my attorney in the following days to inform her they had reviewed the documentation more carefully and had made the wrong decision. Alejandro Montiel resigned from the direction of Global Horizon 16 days after my dismissal. The resignation was presented as a personal decision made to protect the organization during a period of internal review. Nobody in the sector believed that narrative. The tax investigations in the 3 countries are ongoing. International legal processes of this nature are slow because of the coordination they require between jurisdictions, but they're also difficult to stop once in motion because documentary evidence does not disappear and tax information exchange treaties exist exactly for situations like this. The European Foundation and 2 additional donors filed civil lawsuits for fund recovery. Global Horizon as an organization entered a restructuring process under new temporary management designated by the renewed board, which after the events had lost 7 of its original 12 members and had been reconstituted with external people. Whether the organization will survive with enough credibility to continue operating is a question that still has no answer. The field projects, the water wells, and the schools and the health programs that were real, those are in the process of being transferred to local organizations that can continue them without the contamination of what happened at the central headquarters. That is what matters most. My dismissal was declared null in the labor process my attorney initiated immediately. Not for the amount of the compensation, which was significant, but because the declaration of nullity established in a legal document that the board's voting process had been improper and that my separation had no justified basis. That document is part of my professional file now. It is the formal counterpart of what happened in that room. I found work 8 months later at an international independent auditing organization in the nonprofit sector, which is exactly the kind of work where the experience of having seen a fraud system from the inside is an asset rather than a stigma. What I want you to take from this story has 2 levels. The first is practical for those who donate to nonprofit organizations. Before donating, verify that the organization publishes its audited financial statements in an accessible way. Verify that restricted funds have specific usage reports. Ask what percentage of resources reaches the projects directly and what percentage goes to administrative expenses. Transparent organizations have no problem answering those questions. The second is deeper. A person's charisma is not evidence of their integrity. Noble causes do not guarantee that the people who represent them are noble. And when you have evidence that someone is betraying the trust of the most vulnerable people by using their suffering as cover for their own enrichment, the cost of speaking is always lower than the cost of staying silent. Always. If this story shook you from the inside, comment. Do you verify fund use before donating to an NGO? Like if you believe transparency in humanitarian organizations is not optional. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who donates to organizations and needs to know they have the right to ask for accountability. Practical tip: before donating to any nonprofit organization, look for their audited financial statements on their website or in the public records of the country where they operate. Platforms like GuideStar or Charity Navigator in the United States and their equivalents in other countries rate the financial transparency of organizations. If an organization does not publish its finances in an accessible way, that in itself is a signal